Not yet. Go live.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Page Turners Plus. For those of you who have been following us on social media, you may have realized that we started our Instagram page. And so we recommend that on our Instagram, YouTube, or Facebook pages, you can comment in the comment section any contemporary Caribbean literature that you think is worth reading. Today, we'll be reflecting on Astrid Roemer's On a Woman's Madness. To tell you a bit more about Astrid Roemer and her novel, which has recently been translated, we have Francine.
Thank you, Roger. Hello, everyone. Astrid Roemer is a poet, novelist, playwright, teacher, and a trailblazer of Dutch Caribbean literature. She has been awarded the two most prestigious literary prizes in the Dutch speaking world. Born in Suriname, she moved to Holland at age 19. On a Woman's Madness is her most celebrated work. The complexity of the novel is startling, particularly since the author was only 25 years old when she completed it. On a Woman's Madness is a seminal work. Overtly anti colonial and feminist, it explores the caste and color stratifications of Surinamese society during the early to mid 20th century, the nature of internalized racism, complex family dynamics, sexism in the delivery of healthcare, prejudice and ignorance which leads to the maltreatment of the mentally ill, as well as the dynamics of romantic relationships, not only between men and women, but also between men and women and women. Back over to you, Roger.
All right, thank you very much, Francine. Kesua, I feel like the bio that was read by Francine might have raised some hairs for you, and you may have found it controversial. Is there anything you want to address there?
I think not so much the bio, but the synopsis, because I think one thing that at the heart of this book is the theme of love. I think it's about love. It's about a woman learning to love herself, um, and growing to recognize her truest form of love, or the way that she expresses love most easily or most naturally is when she loves another woman. And it really is that journey. But I also think she does some quite interesting things with the idea of queerness. Um, because long before she kind of has that sort of sexual self-realization or actualization or self-actualization, I'm not sure which one it is. Psychiatry is not my thing. But before she has that sexual kind of awakening in some respects, she also has she learns to live outside of the norms of mainstream society. She's ostracized very obviously, very clearly. And so being other, she's encouraged to live as a normal woman. And the novel very much queries what normal looks like. So I think it's about queerness in quite expansive terms of beyond sexuality. That's why our synopsis could be improved upon. Although obviously my colleagues are wonderful.
Well, interestingly, go ahead, Paula.
No, I don't think that the novel is about queerness. It's about a woman who is queer, but I don't believe that queerness is the raison d'etre of the novel. The novel, I don't think, concentrates on her sexuality any more than it concentrates on the relationship between her parents, women's status within marriage in the mid 20th century. There's so many other themes that are huge and are dealt with in a complex way that I don't know. I don't understand why you would view this novel as a novel about queerness. It's a novel about a woman who is queer. But I don't agree that it's a novel about queerness.
But I don't think we're disagreeing, because I don't think it's about queerness in a sexual sense of the word. I think it's about otherness or difference, and queerness in that sense. Perhaps I wasn't clear enough. And I think that's a running theme throughout the novel. And that ends, like you say, well, not ends, but towards the end, that becomes that sexuality becomes the focus of that otherness. But throughout, the idea of how a woman fits into the society that she lives in, how a woman who then is, I'm not spoiling anything here, divorced, fits into that same space, or isn't divorced but tries to separate. Trying to be her own self is what makes her different, and living according to her own norms is what makes her different. And when I say it's about queerness, I mean queerness in that very kind of pure sense of being different, not necessarily in the sense of sexuality, but that is part of her queerness as well. The main character's queerness.
Uh, and interestingly, you early in your answer, Kesua, you said that it's a novel about love, and traditionally when we hear the word love, we immediately jump to romantic relationships, but this is a novel about familial relationships, motherhood, friendships, essentially. And throughout the novel, you get the impression that there's so much fracturing between the individuals that you're not sure whose side you really want to be on. So the question that I want to throw out to the panel is every major character in this novel utterly selfish, or is something else going on with them? Who wants to begin?
That was the impression I got when I read the novel, that they were all extremely self-centered. Everybody seemed to me to be more concerned about themselves than about anybody else, and I think that is what led to the problems they had, the major characters had in relationships. That was just my overall impression.
And then I also got the impression that each individual was so broken, and so many of them. I mean, they were not broken beyond repair. Well, let me not say that, because broken, they were bent. Some of them weren't broken; they were bent, and societal pressure placed them on in such difficult positions that, I mean, I could almost excuse their selfishness, because it was literally a war that they had to fight with themselves and with society. So were they selfish? Yes. Were they wrong to be selfish? No. That's how I saw it.
I didn't think they were any different than we are, the average person. But it made me reflect on the fact that perhaps all of us, maybe all of us, the problems we have in relationships, it's because we're selfish.
Yeah, I was going to say that I agree with Roll J. Yes, they were selfish, but my whole thing throughout reading the book was like, why? Like, what led them to this? And I feel like there was a lot of fracturing, as Roll J said, and there was a lot of not just fracturing with the main characters, but like intergenerational fracturing. There was a lot of people breaking away from their families and maybe not remaining in touch with, I don't know, their roots and traditions, which probably then fed down through the generations and led to the main characters being the way that they are. That was my take on it as I was reading.
I also didn't read the characters as particularly selfish, as more as kind of broken and trying to live in a space that constricted them emotionally and didn't allow them to express themselves. I think there's that line towards the end of the novel, um, where somebody says, I think everybody chooses their own impression, what they can handle, which impressions they're willing to accept. And that for me was the theme that you could see in all of the characters' choices. So it wasn't so much that they were selfish. I didn't read them as selfish so much as kind of making difficult choices under difficult circumstances, and trying to choose in that kind of love is blind way themselves, in the midst of in the midst of difficult choices.
And I guess to add to that, I could ask, were they in a state of denial? Because even you record well, from Noenka's perspective, you get the impression that she was quite aware of a lot of things. She wasn't ignorant to what was happening around her, but was you wonder if the people around her were also just as aware as she was, and were they denying their existence, not existence, but denying their realities? Did you get that impression?
One of the things that I found a little hard for me was that in the beginning of the book, I got the feeling that Noenka was actually quite naive and not at all. What's the word? I don't know. She was quite naive. It was when she moved on I realized she was way more worldly than I thought that she was in the beginning of the book, and to me there was a bit of a disjointedness there between her as a young child when she was living with her parents up until the time she got married, basically, and then when she moved away. I felt like it was almost like two different people. She seemed so so worldly, and I don't know, I can't find the right word, and philosophical, and very philosophical. I felt like this was a really philosophical novel. Like everyone was kind of grappling with existentialism and explaining their lives, and it surprised me because I didn't get that feeling of Noenka in the beginning of the book.
I thought Noenka's mother lived in a constant state of denial. Um, I thought, for example, the 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 scene that bothered me the most was when Noenka told her about her encounter with the priest, and she tells Noenka, the church taught me that sex was something to be despised. I loathe sex, but you shouldn't do that because sex is a beautiful thing. No, nothing is wrong with that statement. But in the context in which she said it to Noenka, that just blew my mind. I wanted to hit her upside her head. But I thought that was one example of her denial, her living in a state of denial. But I thought in general that Noenka's mother lived in a constant state of denial.
I mean, you say that, Paula, but then if you think when she's first kind of having problems at work because of the problems in her personal life, her mother is the first person to defend her and ultimately leaves the church because of it. So I do think we see, even in the very early stages of the book, that her mother, despite having those kind of habits, I think I'd agree with you, of kind of denying the injustice around them, she also is pushed to act when she can no longer deny it, when it affects her child. And that is a little bit stereotypical, when it comes home, suddenly the injustice is real. But I think that is the journey that her mother goes on. And her mother is like her biggest advocate, and that love that her mother shows for her, that willingness to kind of disrupt her whole worldview in defense of her child, is a love that then powers through the novel, and her grief around her mother's death later on. Sorry, that is a spoiler. Is gonna shape Noenka's own journey. It's an important part of it.
No, but the love between Noenka and her mother, I thought, was unhealthy. Um, Noenka, Noenka is her darling. We understand that. And I know I'm a mother too. I'm not going to deny any mother her darling, but it's it's that kind of love that makes the child feel that she's the center of the universe. And I thought Noenka was a very selfish person. And I thought, yes, absolutely, Miss Kesawa. And, and I thought that because maybe I'm projecting because I do know people like that who were raised their parents' dolly, and they think that the world revolves around them. And I think the way the kind of relationship between Noenka and her mother would have made Noenka think that she was a dolly and she was the most precious thing on earth. And so the only person who she needs to look out for is Noenka. Because even though Noenka was in this horrible, toxic marriage to this horrible, toxic human being, don't forget how Noenka entered into that marriage. Noenka had her reasons, and they were not pure and lofty. That she entered that marriage for reasons that were not at all lofty. So, as much as I am on her side in respect of the relationship between her and Louis, um, I haven't lost sight of the fact that Noenka had some. She didn't have pure motives in entering into that relationship.
I mean, I also got the impression that Noenka's mother was in a state of confusion because even the situation you mentioned with the priest Paula, I mean, you got the impression she wanted to be a loving mother, but there was something off about her, especially in the earlier stages of the novel, that I just couldn't wrap my head around, to be quite honest. And so when you compare it to the I put it this way, another mother in the novel, um do you see differences between the styles? And I'm going to mention Gabrielle. And do you see differences between how they acted as mothers and how they dealt with their children?
Well, Gabrielle is a stereotypical perfect mother. So, you know, that I don't think you could, to my mind, she's way, a way better mother than Noenka's mother. And I'm not denying Noenka's mother's love for Noenka. I'm not saying there was any, it was wrong for her to love her child. But the way in which she loved her child, I think, led to unhealthy results. Um, what I found interesting was about the motherhood was this perhaps is the first novel we've read that where motherhood was a strong theme, where we had such supportive mothers. The only mother who was not supportive was Picha. Picha had a very difficult relationship with Emile. Was that her name? It was Emile. Um,
Emily.
Emily, right? Her husband was Emile, right? Um, so Peter is the kind of mother we are used to in Caribbean literature because we talk about it all the time. You know, Caribbean writers seem to like to dwell on these unhealthy parent-child relationships. So that for me was new that we saw these very supportive mothers, albeit I think in Nuenka's mother mother's case, misguided supportive.
I mean, I think in Noenka's mom's defense, I think the nature of that relationship or the unhealthiness comes from the fact that I think what the book is kind of pointing to all the way through that because of the limitations placed on women in the context that they're living in, Noenka's mom could find so little happiness or fulfillment elsewhere, right? And so she was obliged to have this like super deep relationship with her youngest child because also Noenka's not an only child. You know, it's always a shock when her brothers and sisters turn up. You're like, huh? There's other people in this family? Because you're right, she is kind of because I think and that is something about the child's image, right? Because the child sees her mother as the center, the child is the center of her mother's universe in the child's eyes. But in reality, from what we understand, the mother has other children that she loves perfectly well. Like she's the one, like she's the youngest, and so she's spoiled, but she's not the only child. And the others don't have terrible relationships with the mother. It's not like the mother treated her like she was the only child.
Yeah, but she was a lot younger than her other
Right, I was
siblings,
going to
and
say, I think she was practically an only child. I mean, at the time she was writing about, she would have practically been an only child. Her older brothers and sisters would have had already gone off. So, yeah, that definitely explained that.
The time this novel was written in, you also have to sort of factor in Noenka's gender and that she's the youngest as well. So I mean, I would probably reach here and say that she was seen as being the hope of the family, and that she would want the be the successful one that the family could be proud of in inverted commas. I don't know, Paul. You
but
see,
no, but they all were quite
Mhm.
successful. So I don't think there was that kind of
Very
pressure
middle,
on Noenka.
very middle class jobs. I know they're like accountants and teachers and lawyers. And there's a whole background to that as well.
Yeah, but I also got the impression that they were quite distant from the family because I mean, they were only mentioned a few times in the novel when they just popped up at random times and then disappeared. You remember? I think I don't want to give any spoilers, but when the mother was ill and they just showed up and it
Yeah,
was like at
but
the yeah. Go ahead,
remember
Paul.
we're hearing it from Noenka's perspective, and she's a lot younger than they are. So I think that explains why we don't see more of them. I don't think that it's anything other than that.
That's the impression
And
I got as well.
and on that note, I'm now starting to wonder, is Noenka an unreliable narrator? As you said, Paula, we're seeing everything from her point of view. We have no idea, really. She's the one reporting on the conversations and the happenings. So, you know,
I
I
didn't
mean,
think
she
she was
can.
particularly. Sorry, I keep
unreliable.
disturbing. Yeah, I didn't think she was particularly unreliable. Unreliable to the extent that all of us only see the world through
Right,
our
right.
lens. But I
Yes.
don't think she was
Like she
particularly
wasn't
unreliable.
right. She wasn't deliberately like misconstruing events, but we literally were only getting like her perspective. And I also want to point out too that she was really young when all these events occurred, right? Like really, really younger than I realized until her actual age was revealed. And I think that also played a big role in her perspective of what was happening.
I think that speaks as well to the time it's written in, right? Because she's essentially a teenager for a lot of the book, or just out of her teens, really early 20s. But it doesn't read at all like some kind of YA or young adult fiction at all. This is a book for adults with very adult themes, and I think that speaks to sort of, well, yeah, the fact that it's an earlier time. Childhood is less precious, and she's not sheltered in any way, shape, or form. She is a young woman growing up in a difficult situation, difficult time. And did anyone know that? And I think no is probably not the right word, but pick up on the fact that this book is published kind of when Suriname at war. Like there's a whole civil war happening in Suriname, and I was thinking about what that meant for the portrayal of the mother. Is that why perhaps we see this kind of really, really outstanding mothers? Because you do have, I'm not an expert on Suriname civil war, right? But you do have these situations where it breaks up quite suddenly, and people who are in the interior at the time visiting family get trapped there for 5-6 years, and vice versa. If you were in town the day it happened, you were stuck in town. So the country's kind of really divided. That's fair. I just wonder if that's why we see a particular vision of motherhood, because mothers are now in a position where they have to physically protect their children in a way that we don't often get in the Caribbean. We don't often get war time stories, but this isn't one. So.
But this novel was set. I think the earliest scenes we see in the novel was around World War One. Yes, remember the father. Remember the novel starts off with a history of the father's family. So actually, no, we see it earlier than that because we see the family enslaved, and then when we see the father is a soldier in World War One, and then when Noenka comes to adulthood, young adulthood, it's World War Two. I don't know. I don't know. I don't think I'm wrong, but that was the impression I got.
Well, I think this would probably be a good time to see if our readers would agree with us, or viewers rather would agree with us, because they'll now listen to Astrid Roemer reading from her novel On a Woman's Madness. Stay tuned. We'll be right back.
I'm Astrid Roemer. I will read a part from my novel On a Woman's Madness. Hoewel ik van de oorlog alleen de bijtend zoete.
Although my only taste of the war was the piercing sweet flavor of canned chocolate milk, my mother was scared to death of making the journey on the Princess Wilhelmina because of the deafening military aircraft that continually patrolled the coast and, so it was said, occasionally sank the wrong ship. We headed inside. My father, unable to sway her toing and froing, focused his objections around me. If you absolutely must visit your sister at a time like this, so be it, but leave my child at home. My child, she cackled, and putting on a show of stubbornness, packed our things in 2 separate suitcases. Eyebrows raised, he brought out his leather military satchel, saying that traveling with a single bag would be easier. With only a veneer of courtesy, she shoved it back into his arms. Each having her own bag suited her better. He shook his head as he watched us go from the wide pair, his green hat in hand, straight-backed, thin. I didn't dare wave. The next day, over a breakfast of cold cassava and fried herring at a crowded table in the ship's mess, she made a few things clear to me. For the first 6 days, I'd be left with a close acquaintance in New Iniquerai. She'd be with family in Guyana. Who is this close friend, and why are you going on without me? I grumbled. She looked at me, the same way she'd often looked at her husband, with a "who the hell do you think you are" expression, and said coolly, "Be nice to Lady Morgan. Help out if you can. Go to bed early. Don't ask me any questions about this. Got it?" I nodded. With a giant lump in my throat, and attempted to toss back as composed a look at her, but we only burst out into hearty laughter. The house on the Rivière Weg was old-fashioned, not updated. The elegant interior remained the moribund evidence of bygone glory. The tiled floor had gleamed in the old days. The candlesticks had once burned with white flames. I noticed the mirrors. They'd preserved every wet breath. And the porcelain ornaments, I shuddered. Pale and evil, the dancing men and women stared into the room. Only the lady of the house had bested the ravages of time, her skin and body unblemished, except for her malicious, aggressive hands, which belied her frail gentility. I kissed her. She kissed me back on both cheeks, held me at arm's length, then hugged me to her again with pleasure. She's practically a grown woman, she mused aloud. My mother nodded. She's got the touch of womanly beauty, your Nunca, she went on, switching from Dutch to English. I heard concern in her voice and looked to see how my mother would respond. She gave another relaxed nod. Then she gave her a big kiss. We broke into loud laughter at the colored stigmata on our faces.
All right, welcome back. So just before we took the reading, we were kind of discussing our familiarity with the Suriname landscape and the events at which that were occurring at the time the novel was set. So I think I want to draw some references to a novel that we reviewed in January of this year, The Drowned Forest. And The Drowned Forest introduced us to a community we were not familiar with. Did you have the same feeling of discovery when you read On a Woman's Madness? And was there anything about what we learned of Suriname in the novel that resonated with you?
I mean, I jump in and be like, speak for yourself, not familiar with. Who's not familiar with Bermuda? Um, like, I think, yeah, I'd like you to pick that apart. What do you mean you're not familiar with this community that we read about in the Drowned Forest? I mean, I'm being slightly facetious, but I think you should be really clear about what you think.
Pessoa, I thought that none of us had been to Bermuda. But I wasn't. So you obviously have been, but I haven't. And I didn't think any of the rest of us had.
I haven't been to Bermuda physically, that is true. But I'm familiar with its history, its stories, its kind of uniqueness within the Caribbean. I wouldn't say I mean, I'm not. That doesn't make me an expert on Bermuda. I'm not saying I'm super familiar with it, but I certainly think about it when I think about the Caribbean in ways that I think people often forget because they are British citizens, always have been, right? And I can see why. I mean, I'm being facetious, right? I think one of the reasons I'm interested in Suriname, and don't think of myself as, again, expert, but I have been to Suriname twice, and have spent a little bit of time there, not loads, a couple of weeks here and there. And I find it a fascinating country. I think it challenges a lot about what we think of when we say Caribbean. I do this with my students as well, because it doesn't speak English. It's not their first language. It's not an island. But yeah, it is as Caribbean as anyone else in lots of ways. And so when you say it's unfamiliar or it's familiar, what do you mean by that really? Because it is undoubtedly a Caribbean. Anyway,
I mean, I've been to Suriname once. It's not on my radar because it's not English speaking. I mean, I don't think of the Caribbean as an English speaking region. I'm always very aware of the fact that we're multilingual. But then because it's on the mainland and we don't have, as island dwelling people, we don't have that much contact with the mainland Caribbean nations. Because it's not English speaking, again, we don't have that much contact. And I think Suriname is, apart from Trinidad, much more multi-ethnic than most of the Caribbean, apart from Trinidad and Guyana, of course, because so in those respects, one of the things I found interesting is that I did not assume that there would be, people would have family members in Guyana, for example, as Surinamese people, and so that was a revelation to me. And then when I thought about it, I said, but of course they would have family members The colonizers were always fighting over these territories. Um, you couldn't just step from one border over into the other. But that for me, that sent off a light bulb in my head because I just had never thought about the fact that the possibility and probably the likelihood that you would, if you're Surinamese, you would have cousins in English speaking Guyana or French speaking Guyana.
And
And friends who are from those places, neighbors that are from those places, right? Because these are just natural land borders that cross very easily.
and that's why I think I was really excited to read this translation, because for the ordinary reader in the English speaking Caribbean, a lot of the things that Roma mentioned in the novel, the landscape, the sort of the multicultural society, because not many people would know that there are people, Javanese people in Suriname. We might just think of Suriname as one big block of people, but you have the indigenous people. Suriname actually has a huge maroon population. You have people who came from India. You have the people of African descent. It is quite a melting pot of cultures. And outside of Suriname, a lot of people in the English speaking Caribbean, unless you specifically sit down to study Surinamese history, you wouldn't know these things. And it is the same thing with Bermuda, which is why I was quite surprised that Kesiwa, I mean, Kesiwa obviously has like in-depth knowledge of Bermuda, but I didn't. I mean,
I think Kessa was the only one among us who knew
yeah,
anything about Bermuda.
precisely. And then
I
you
mean,
have
the recorder is an amazing newspaper, and it's something like, how did you not know that, Jacob?
but then even in terms of how Roma paints the landscape, in terms of getting on the train and crossing these rivers and all these what you call water bodies, lakes, etc. It's a beautiful portrayal of the Surinamese landscape that you wouldn't ordinarily get, and even in terms of Surinamese folklore, because you have quite strongly in the beginning of the novel the mention of my pronunciation is probably wrong, the Dague, or the Dagua, however it is pronounced. And then when you read up on that, you realize that snakes and serpents play a critical role in Surinamese folklore. So I think Romer gives the English speaking, well, this translation of her work gives the English speaking Caribbean quite an insight into Suriname that we ordinarily wouldn't have. And even in terms of a book that I read earlier this year, We Slaves of Suriname, which was recently translated into English as well. I mean, we're seeing so much about Suriname that we ordinarily wouldn't have seen, even in Caribbean history that we study in school.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I
I agree.
remember. Sorry, I remember the only thing I remember from studying Caribbean history about Suriname is the maroon population. I don't remember anything else.
Yeah, I don't remember anything at all. I'm not even sure if we studied Suriname when we did CXC history. I didn't go beyond CXC. Um, I was gonna say that, yeah, I was really completely unfamiliar, but I have to say I have visited Guyana, and I was able to draw, and not just, and I actually flew over fairly extensively. I was there for work, and so the description of the rivers and the lakes and that stuff immediately made me think about Guyana. And just like Paula, when Georgetown popped up, I was like, huh, okay, yeah, that does make sense that they would have a connection with Georgetown and with French Guiana as well, and of course, obviously the Dutch Antilles Islands, ABC Islands as well. But yeah, I would say I was unfamiliar, but there were still things that said Caribbean to me, like the water theme, that even though it was the water that was for them was rivers, but there was this theme of water, that made me think about the Caribbean, because that's like something that's really important and a theme that we've seen in a number of the books that we've read. So yeah, there were definitely things to me that still said, yes, this is definitely part of the Caribbean, apart from the obvious history, of course.
And in spite of the language difference, the word Bacra. I
Yeah,
was like, what?
there were a few words that I was like, okay,
Really?
that's like Creole, that's Creole that you hear in other islands as well. Yeah, definitely.
So my little experience of Suriname is that I think Suriname Tongo, like when people speak it, often it sounds very similar to kind of what I would call like Jamaican or even like West African Pidgin. And so it's much more intelligible, I think, to an English speaker than you might expect for a language you don't know. But on the question of language, I really have to ask this question. Sorry, Roger, but I hope I can just jump in here now. But beyond the descriptions of the landscapes, how did you guys feel about the evocation of the South American coast of Suriname? Does it remind you of Guyana and French Guyana in the way that, you know, did it evoke Wilson Harris or Martin Card from Pauline Melville or John Agar? So because I it struck me that it's obviously I'm reading it with my British voice, and so I'm hearing it back in my British voice, and it sounds like an English person wrote it for me, like an English person writing about the Caribbean, versus with knowledge of it, but it doesn't sit with me in the same way that the Trinidadian writers, when they write, the way that they write, the way that they use English, it sounds like, yeah, it doesn't sound Caribbean to my ears. I don't know how else to say it. I just wanted to
I mean,
anybody else similarly or different.
in fairness to, I would say, Astrid Roemer, this is a translation, and we don't know. And I probably never will know how she wrote it, because I probably never will learn Dutch. But I imagine, just based on how poetic it was, I imagine in Dutch it must have been absolutely beautiful writing. And I think the translator did a good job of trying to make it as poetic as it I assume it is. But it's also a translation that's been made for us to understand. I did not get that.
But
Yeah.
also, I think we need to remember that this is a book from 1982, which is a time when books were not really written in nation language back then. So I assume that it would have been written in primarily in Dutch, standard Dutch. And so the translator did the same thing. But I also feel like the translation is also, it seems to me to be really geared towards Americans, just based on some of the spelling and some of the phrasing. So that might also have something to do with it as well. That was my take. There were a few
It's
things that I
published.
thought, okay, this is an American kind of phrasing of something. It's a more. I think it was translated into American English. I mean, I don't know. Even though
It's it,
Kessel it sounded British, but
no,
I
it's
think
published by
when I
Two Lines Press. So
so when I said
it's an American firm. So I think it's for the American market. To be quite
so
honest.
when I say it sounded British, what I probably mean, it doesn't sound, it didn't, I didn't hear the Caribbeanness in that same kind of way, is what I meant. Not so much it necessarily was British versus American, but just it didn't. And I say that because I had a friend of mine with a really wonderful short story collection. I was like, oh my god, this is amazing. He wrote it in French, peppered with Creole, because he's a Guadeloupe who speaks very French, and always speaks English as well, but French and Creole, and in his text both were present, and in ways that reflected the way that the language is used and the power dynamics sometimes that are represented. And I remember getting about halfway through one of the stories and being like, okay, so it's rendered into English, but I've rendered it into my English. I haven't rendered it into a St. Lucian kind of English, where St. Lucian would also use Creole and English. And that's what I thought was missing from this book. I wondered how much was just ordered into Dutch. And there were times where she translated things like backcrate. Is that something that Dutch people would naturally, that Sunni people would naturally say, or is that just kind of trying to render it into a Caribbean kind of English? That's what I'm asking, really.
Guess what? I happen to have read an interview with Astrid Roemer. We have to remember that Astrid Roemer is not of our generation. She's a middle class Surinamese from a certain era. My aunts, for example, do not speak Creole with the kind of self assurance that my generation speaks Creole, for the simple reason that they were raised in an era where it was bad English. No, it was still bad English when I was being raised, but there was a lot more consciousness raising going on. We were setting the groundwork for to liberate our minds from the idea that our colonizers' version of the language was better than ours. And in fact, it's still, I'm sure if you speak to English teachers, I'm sure of it, that they will still tell children that this is bad English. So you have to remember, one, this is a middle class family you're reading about. Educated middle class family. They would have spoken English, would have been their first language. It is my first language. It's just that I happen to speak Creole very well because, like all middle class people, I was raised by the housekeepers.
Well, the other part of it is as well, is we don't know if in the Surinamese context, the Dutch and Swan and different languages interact in the same way that we know them to in other places. Right?
But I can say that because I did read that interview. I started speaking about it, but I didn't finish the thought. I did read that interview with uh, Bridget Astrid Roemer, and she does have that mindset. She does have the mindset that Creole is all right, but it's not really a language. I did see that. She made that statement. So.
And she also moved to Holland at 19, and she finished this at 25, meaning she wrote this novel while she was living in Holland. So she wouldn't be speaking whatever variation of Dutch they would have in Suriname, Sranan or Dutch Creole or whatever. But we're starting to be short on time. So I wonder something slight controversial mental illness was addressed in the novel. And whose madness was Astrid Roemer referring to? I don't know who was even here.
I think magnificently. Essentially, what she talks about is how that what's the word they use? Oh no, the word's going to escape me. When they pathologize a person's choices, and that's kind of what the madness she's referring to is that there's nothing mad about being a lesbian. But she certainly makes it feel that like she is mad because she doesn't want to stay with this husband, because she doesn't want this conventional middle class life that she could have if she'd only accept domestic violence and being some people. Yeah, I thought it's really brilliant. Stories of one in the 19th century were going to asylum, and she's evoking the kind of traditional way.
It's not, I don't know if it was her sexuality. I think it's the fact that she was a woman who dared to think that she should be able to self actualize. That was pathologized. And it wasn't even just among the doctors who were supposed to treat her for her mental illness, because she did have a mental illness. She was suffering from depression at one point. So it even way before that, the doctor, the GP who was treating her was quite outraged that she had left Louis. And basically, he treated her as though she should have accepted domestic violence, because domestic violence is part of the natural wear and tear of marriage.
Part of me thinks that I don't even know if Noenka is really. I don't want to downplay it, but I think she was more misunderstood than she was mentally ill, because she I think it was society who was just really hard on her. I think that's I mean, and that probably led to mental illness, yes. But I think in the beginning, I think she was just a really misunderstood person, and that turned her into that sort of how do they put it, this nomadic person, who ended up all over Suriname. I don't know what others
No,
think
I
about
agree with you. I agree with you, Rolji. That she was. I didn't even know that it was misunderstanding. I think there was some maliciousness. It certainly was malicious.
I was going to say that. You know this thing about she makes it small. I love the way that she writes, because it's all a nuance or the subtlety. She says, women would nod at her and smile when they were on their own, but then when they were with their husbands and children, they would act all haughty, like she'd done something wrong. So it's like, well, and so she's very good at exposing the hypocrisies that mean that when she makes her own choices, it's not that other people actually resent those choices. Is that they don't want to be seen to be condoning what they think of as what they recognize as considered bad. She talks a lot about judgment and the judgment that she experiences for doing things like what would the guy do? She talks about these Javanese guys looking at her. How dare she would I sit on a train or something? Like just some really random thing that was not anything worth condoning and excited about, but they insisted on doing it, and that she's often bucking up against other people's ideas of who she should be.
Jay, you asked like whose madness, and I mean it's titled On a Woman's Madness, but I think that it's about not just Noenka's madness. I think she was writing about the madness of pretty much all the female characters, and madness not in the sense of mental illness, but in the sense of them doing things that people thought were mad. Really, I mean, they weren't. They were just trying to self-actualize and do things out of the norm, and they were seen that way. And I think she talked about all the different types of madness, so to speak, of various women in the novel. That was my take.
And sometimes it's just to survive as well. Like even step actualization sometimes is a step extra. But then a lot of the time they're just trying to survive the harsh realities that they're facing.
I think that's probably a very controversial way to end the show, but we're out of time. And so the next time you see and hear from us, we'll be interviewing Astrid Roemer. Thank you for joining us. And as always, you could comment on our YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook pages any books that you think we should be reading. Thank you for joining us.